What's going on, family? Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Crossroads, the English segment of the Puerto Rican podcast La Mogolla. Today, Queens is in the building, so I had to do it. I had to do it. I had to do it.
Listen, I respect that.
Hey.
Queens, there you go.
For those who do not know, shook ones, man. Queens, special. Today I have a special guest in Monica Gavilanes.
Hello.
She's from Queens, Ecuador, and Dominican Republic in the building as well, right?
Yes, sir.
Got that
Yes,
right?
sir.
Yes,
sir.
She's a therapist. She's a social worker by trade. Welcome to the Crossroads. I've been waiting to speak to you. I was giving it time, right? I needed to study your work first. I didn't want to go into this interview without, knowing what you did specifically.
I respect that. Thank you.
I respect what you do. We're going to be talking about that a lot. So thank you so much for your time, right? Talk to me. What's going on?
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. You basically got the whole family on your show now, right? Who we missing at this point?
At this point, I don't know who. I don't know who else. I got your boyfriend in, right?
Yeah.
You guys are not married, right?
No, we're we know this is it though. We married in spirit, but
that's
we'll get there eventually.
That's the most important thing.
Living in this country, you need benefits, and they're not gonna give it to us. So that's probably gonna be why.
That's right. So I got your partner, and Jonathan Strong, and his brother as well, Mitch Strong. He was my last episode. It was wonderful. Now I have you. You are offering a lot to the community by, the therapy that you offer, not only for folks, right? Black and Latinx folks, but also therapists, other therapists. This is something a lot of people do not know, that therapists also need therapy, right?
Therapists need a lot of things, child.
Psychology. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about that as well. So talk to me about, about your background, your roots. Let's get it. What's going on?
Yeah. So obviously I'm from Queens, like you said, my mom's Dominican, my father was Ecuadorian. They met here in New York back in the 70s, prime time, as they say. So I'm my background, my story is interesting, but I think it's also a story that as you grow up, especially in the work that I do, you just start to see how common all the themes of my life really are, how shared they are. So I was my mother's only child, but I had an older sister who passed away. And I when I talk about just like the way I even ended up in this work, and obviously because of the work I do, I jokingly say I'm always inundated in trauma, but by choice, so I know those waters very well. It's the story of the first generation eldest daughter after my sister passed that just like really embodies that caretaker role and unknowingly learns how to make an income out of that. And then once I kind of got into the field, right? And I started to really see that it just shifted things. So I actually never even wanted to be a therapist. When I first got into social work, I was still in that I call it like the colonial helper mindset, where I thought I could change the system from within the system. So I remember going to grad school, and I went to Stony Brook. So one day out of the week, I had to take like a 2-hour drive out to Long Island, and we would have like me and my friend, we would take that drive together. And I remember she wanted to go the clinical route and I wanted to go the policy route. And I was like, I can't imagine sitting there and listening to people talk about their problems for an hour. Like, that sounds fucking crazy. Like, I want to build programs. I want to get inside the city and like shake shit up. So I did that for a really long time. I ended up, my first job after undergrad was in a juvenile detention center for young girls out in South Queens, actually. It was the toughest job out of everything. Like, because you were caretaking for young girls that were discarded, really, by their families and by the system. And it was the daily navigation of like their grief that expressed itself in anger and like aggression and violence. But it was tough. And that was the first time where I really kind of started to think something about the way that we operate in social services and the helping profession is not right. But like we were talking before we kind of started recording live, there's a process to that awareness, you know, there's layers to taking off the blinders. So I think that was like the first time where I was connected to a system that I felt like I was perpetuating harm, but I wanted to convince myself otherwise, because I think so much of the unlearning, it's so destabilizing because it causes you to really like grieve an identity that you lived with your entire life and create a new one. And that's a lot of work, right? So that's why people kind of cling on to like what they know. So I got into the city, and you know, I'm an energizer bunny, right? So I moved up the ranks pretty quickly, and I worked in CUNY, the City University. I worked in DOE. I worked in DOH, and my last stop was actually ACS. And for those folks who aren't familiar, that's our Administration for Children's Services here in New York. So when people think about ACS, they typically think about the folks that go into people's homes and, you know, remove the children from the families. So this was actually the lockdown here in New York started in March, I believe, of 2020, and I got hired February of 2020. And at this point, I had really kind of like done a lot of personal work. So I like understood my trauma in the context of, you know, society and all that stuff. So I found myself at ACS, and I was working from home at this point, like everybody else. And the job was easy as shit. And I remember like telling my cousin who I lived with at the time, like, I don't think I can do this. And she was like, just collect the paycheck. Like, I see what you do. You don't do shit. And I'm like, this does not feel right. Like, this does not feel right. I am literally upholding a system that disproportionately impacts my community. And they're doing what, you know, systems do, which is create this facade of care. But now, in the position that I'm in, I'm actually seeing the reality of it. And I was like, I can't do this. So throughout all this, right, I'm doing therapy part-time because everyone's broke and I need all the money I can get to survive, right? So that was like my little side gig. But I as I started to kind of heal within myself, I became a lot more emotionally available and aligned and grounded. And there's no coincidence that then my work just kind of felt better and improved. And I was working for a group practice, but I was only seeing maybe like 5 clients.
Okay.
And I remember when I got to the decision where I was like, I'm going to quit the city. Like, I cannot do this. And if you are a New Yorker, you know that getting a city gig, you've reached the promised land. You get a pension, you get benefits. It's like you don't give up a city position. And I was only like 3 years shy of like being vested in my pension and all this stuff. So when I resigned, everybody thought I was crazy. And when they found out I resigned and I didn't even have a job, they thought I was even crazier. But I had to go. And I know now that that was like my ancestors like talking to me, because the message would not let up, where it was like, you need to leave. Yeah, you could coast, but you need to leave. The money was never worth it for me. Money, for me, time and like life experience is so much more important. So I quit, and I ended up starting my own practice. And I know that it was successful because of the reason why I started it, because I was really trying to, for the first time in my life, live out my values. And because I think, you know, I think more so now, I would say in 2023 than back then. I always say that I mark that as the beginning of time of when like almost like the activist persona and the wellness like stuff started to become like an archetype and like an identity. So, and like that's cute and all, but I think, you know, decolonial thinking is like daily consistent actions and how you're actually like living your life, right? It's not like these big abstract concepts that people feel overwhelmed by. It's just how you kind of live. So that was the first time I think I really started to do that. So I started just doing individual therapy for a really long time. And I just kind of grew my skill set around that. And I just found myself naturally speaking to clients about what we talk about, you know, like, hey, yeah, it's not imposter syndrome. You know, it's not something you have to get over. This is like internalized inferiority, because the core of who you are, you've gotten indirect and direct messages your whole life that there's something wrong with it. Like, let's talk about where you learned these things. You know,
Yeah.
yes, you're suffering from anxiety. Okay, what does that even mean? You know, what before we had labels for these things, how did we understand that internal experience, and what did we do to kind of help us navigate that, right? Like, so it just was very organic. I really, like many things in my life, I didn't go into it with strategy. I
Okay.
always just kind of fell into it. But then I gave myself space to take a look back, and I was just like, this is what I want to be doing. Like, so how can I formalize this a little bit more?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I really like niched down into, I only want to support people in this way. And my people found me, like I kind of like put my messages out there, and folks are really interested in working with someone who they felt, kind of mirrored their experience, but then also really affirmed this idea of like, no, you're not crazy. Like, society
Exactly.
has been gaslighting you your whole life. You
Yeah.
should be pissed off. We're not going to try to anger manage you into submission. Like,
Yeah.
let's fucking be mad. I'll be mad with you. Come on. Like, so people were really like vibing with that. And then the pivot I'm into now, which you mentioned, like now working with therapists. So the more that I like really kind of, because I'm a loner, like it's very easy
Mm-hmm.
for me to like go into my cave and tinker away and come out with something. And that again is like the way that society and our profession especially really kind of reinforces like such like individualized work. So there isn't
Mm-hmm.
much community building. So when I started to seek that out, I really I feel so bad, but I always say this with love. I just started to see therapists and be like, oh, there's so many issues with the way that we think, with the way
Mm-hmm.
that we support our communities, with the way that we uphold white supremacy, with the way that we perpetuate harm and operate like soldiers of the state. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so many issues. So I made a conscious decision to kind of pivot away from typical therapy and really create spaces where the healer can heal, but then also have that where it's like facilitated, where they can begin to really understand and confront the ways in which we've been trained and what
Yeah.
we need to unlearn. And it's been it's been interesting because therapists, listen, I could say it as one. We are not easy. And you are
Yeah.
with one, so I don't know if you agree, but we are not easy. So it's been very interesting, but it's been amazing. And I'm like grateful that it's even been something that people are open to, because it's really allowed me to find more community of like-minded folks. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Being with a psychologist is interesting, right? The funny thing is that she's my partner, right? She's my fiance. We're about to get married soon, and we've been together for 9 years. But I had mentors before, right? Mentors that were psychologists as well. So I was in that world already. I knew people that were older than me, and were showing me the way that we're already in that world. So I'm like, oh, I'm with here's another person, right? That's in that field. And it's interesting how she can apply the things she knows on me, right? It's hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's over with, right? But it's
Yep.
interesting what you mentioned, that people thought you were crazy when you gave up that job, right? Because of the benefits it had, and X and Y and whatever. But they need to understand that when you understand how things work and the healing that you have to go through, you have to step out of line,
Yep.
right? Stepping out of
Yep.
line for them is crazy. But in your case, and in other people's that are trying to help, their communities and themselves, they have to step out of line, because if they keep in that line, right? If they keep in that order, they just become another, just another peon, right?
Yeah.
But you stepping out of line made your community find you. You were
Mm-hmm.
there to be found, right? So, if you weren't the person that you are and said, you know what, I'm going to do it my way, right? Because I'm noticing certain things that are not being considered in our jobs, our way of thinking. And, I need to heal. I need to heal, and I need to heal others as well. So stepping out of line was the best thing you did.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I noticed, right? In my perspective.
100%. 100%. And I think, and this was the start of the process for me, because there was still so much like shedding and like dusting off of the residue that I even had to do. But I think one of the biggest takeaways for me, and something that really couples into this like liberation-centered decolonial work that I'm privileged to like kind of facilitate is people really think this is it. Like people really think that, and I mean that on multiple levels, right? Like systemically, I mean that like earthly, you know what I mean? And it's like when you are able to understand the interconnection and the way that this way of being that we've been taught is not the only resource. We have ancestral resources, we have spiritual resources, we have internal resources, we have the resource of time not being a construct and how that can kind of express itself through us. You understand that you're not actually like stepping out on a limb by yourself, you know, like you're going to be carried through. And I think faith, you know, is something that I've really given myself permission to talk about a lot more in my work with people. Because again, right, people look at you crazy, like, what do you mean? Like, I'm not going to be able to pay my bills. And I'm supposed, like, faith is not going to pay my bills. My ancestors not going to pay my bills. I'd be like, boo, you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised. You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's layered.
Yeah, it's layered. It's layered. And you spoke about grief earlier and losing your sister. This is a younger sister or older sister?
No, this was my older sister. Yeah, this was my older sister. Her name was Karen. So when my father he was married, and he was with my mother afterwards. So she was my older sister. When I was born, Karen was already 17 years old. So she was actually like a mother figure to me.
Okay.
And we looked alike, so she would play into that too. Like when we grew up, like, "Oh, is that your kid?" And she's like, "Yeah, that's my kid." But my sister passed away back in 1999, so I was 9 years old. And it's interesting because me and my partner talk about this a lot. And some people might find it annoying, but the way in which I can kind of track back how her death and the way that she passed away was a consequence of colonization, imperialism, the violence against, like, you know, Black and brown communities. I hate the term brown, but I say it because that's what most people like understand.
Yeah,
but that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. But you know, so understanding that, so she passed away from stomach cancer. Actually, she was only 29 years old. She was really young. But she was extremely unhealthy, and she had a lot of trauma herself. Like her mother was an alcoholic till this day. My father, you know, also passed away, and in this, you know, in his tenure here, he also had a lot of trauma. You know, he came from Ecuador, and big family, but there was so much like classism within his family. There was so much pressure to really adhere to these like American standards and forget who you were and kind of leave that behind. So, you know, when you assimilate, it's an exchange. You know, you have to give something up in order to do that. So, yeah, he was a capitalist through and through, and it ran him dry. And so he wasn't around for her the same way he wasn't able to be around for me. So she had a lot of wounding that, you know, back then, I think there's more understanding about it now, but the way in which like emotional injuries manifest physically, and the way that like our pain literally will find a location in the body. And that's what we come to know as illness, right? There's a really great book about that, how like there's nothing in our genetics. I don't know if you've read it, The Myth of Normal.
I haven't.
Where such a good book. Gabor Mate is the author. He's
yes. I know him.
Yeah.
Mate. He's great.
Book.
Yeah, he's great. I should read his work. Yeah.
Oh my God. So this is his newest one. I think it came out last year. And he talks about how like it's not genetics. It's all a manifestation of trauma where we have certain sensitivities, right? So like cancer, my father passed away from cancer. My sister passed away from cancer.
Wow.
2 of my uncles passed away from cancer. So like the conversation has always been like, oh, it runs in your genes. It runs in your genes, right? And that's how I understood it too, which is why I ended up making lifestyle changes. I went plant-based. I tried to like, you know, change my life so stress wasn't such a big factor. But the trauma of her life was the cancer. You know what I mean? It wasn't the genetic malfunction of her body. Like that's what it was. It was the abandonment because capitalism and its structure forced my father outside of the home. It was her trauma because her mother's own inability to navigate this country made her into an alcoholic, you know what I mean? And then all that stuff. But that's like the familial grief, if you will.
Yeah.
I know now, right? So then I had to go through my own grieving process with that, especially because all of that happened like when I was really young. So the way I handled the grief was like anger. That was me, and anger's my girl. I know
Yeah.
anger very well.
Yeah.
So I went through that myself, and seeing how that then manifested physically in me was really interesting. It's really interesting to look back now because I think that I was living like most people in a state of dissociation for the better part of my life. And we talked about this earlier, the idea of just like having to confront the identity that you formed when you're still like aligning with this, like that is really hard. Like I remember when I started to do so much work, having to let go of this idea that like, oh no, I'm powerless, like this is just in my genes, this is why I'm, you know, I have asthma, this is why I was extremely overweight, this is why I have anxiety. But like understanding that these are all lies that you've been told as a
Yeah.
way to understand yourself, therefore limit yourself and your power. Yeah, it's a ride, man. It's a
You know what I
ride.
wanted to mention too? Your father was living in New York City, right? This is where
Yep.
you were born and raised.
Yep.
So the thing is that you mentioned capitalism a lot, right? And that manifests in so many ways. But when you're in a metropolis like New York City, it's a whole different ballgame. And I wanted
Yep.
to mention that because I can't imagine the levels of hustle that he had to like, you know, do to actually make it and actually put some, you know, food on the table and pay the bills and pay the, you know, have a roof. And New York City is so expensive. It's always been, right? Now it's more than
Always.
ever due to
Yeah.
inflation and whatever. But in the end of the day, New York City has always been a place where you have to hustle to like actually live, right? So
Yep.
I can't imagine your father coming from Ecuador, you know, facing a city like that, right? Having to assimilate
Yeah.
not only the American culture or capitalism, but also that same level of hustle. Because if not,
Yeah.
he stays behind. So that drains people. You know, it drains people. You have to be really aware of how that manifests in the body and the mind, you know, in the spirit. So you understand that, right? And you've been able to breathe. You've been able to grieve. You've been able to heal yourself. You've been able to overcome a lot of things. But you also are aware that these things, you know, hustling so hard every day, you know, from 8 to 5, and knowing that it doesn't stop there, right? Knowing that you have to have a side gig, knowing that you have to have a
Yep.
second job,
Yep.
knowing that you have to accept what the rules are, right? In each job. It's crazy. You know, it's hard.
Yeah.
I don't think we are supposed to like be going through these things, but in the end of the day, that's reality. And we have to find tools to overcome these things. And I think you've done a great job, right? What your sister did not know and your father did not understand, you are teaching. So you know, it's grief, but at the same time, it's a solid foundation, I think, right? So you were 9 years old when your sister passed.
Yeah.
And how old were you when your dad passed away?
11 years old. So there
11.
was a period of my life where I had a family member pass every year. So my uncle passed away from AIDS at 7. My grandfather, who I was very close to, my father's father, when I was 8. My sister 9. My father 11. Um, yeah, yeah, a lot of grief. And it's funny because you know, back then, so I was raised in predominantly in my Dominican family. Like that's my culture. Like it's a lot of like family drama happens because of I mean my father's family side is just super trash. So after he passed away and there was a bunch of drama, I kind of annexed everybody except for like my godfather and my godmother. But so I didn't really grow up culturally Ecuadorian, and it wasn't until I got older that I started to kind of try to reclaim that culture and those learnings. And because his background is Quechua, so like really trying to like ground myself and all that. But I was raised by my Dominican culture, and that side of the family, it's, I think, you know, I'll say this assuming that most Dominicans, like, this is kind of like a general experience. It's that mixed bag of like, you have some folks in the family that practice like 21 divisions, and you have some folks in the family that are Christian, and you have some folks in the family that are Pentecostal. So, you know, and it's like the same person that is like walking around with a rosary and saying that's the devil's work will tell you, oh yeah, but you have to put the jar with this in front of your door. And it's like a lot of confusion, right? So
Yeah.
I grew up that with that like belief framework. And you know, when my father passed away, like we do the hora santa, and like that was like the understanding of like his passing. And it wasn't until I got older and I just in a couple different ways I started to like tap into other belief systems, right? Like Ifa. And then really cultivating that once I got into a relationship with my partner, because he was raised in that. So he had a different experience than I did, right? So he's kind of been like helping shepherd my learning and relationship with that in a lot of different ways, is when I was able to understand like, oh, all those people had to leave because I needed a lot of support on the other side. If they were still here physically, they were going to be limited in the way in which they were going to be able to support whatever karmic work I'm supposed to be doing right now, and thereafter and thereafter and thereafter. And like, I needed them on the other side, you know, and that's something that I think sometimes, you know, spirituality can be used to minimize human pain. But I think like when you're able to actually tap in and like feel it on an embodied level, like, no, it's just like truth. That's just like what it is. Yeah. So when I talk about my story, people are always kind of like, oh my God. And it's like, yeah, I was there too. But also it's kind of like, you know, they're right here, like, you know, every day. And my father's energy, because he was a rebel, in every fucking sense. Like my father did not care about rules. He literally like, he ended up opening up a corner store, and by the time he passed, we found out how many building violations he did, because he was just like, I'm not gonna wait, I'm just gonna build this thing, I don't care. Like so much of that in me comes from him, you know. And it's interesting because he passed away when I was 11, so like I was old enough to be able to like, you know, blend with some of his stuff, but it's not like he guided that in me, right? But he is in a different way.
It's necessary. It's necessary. If not, things don't get done, right? It's stepping out of line again. Stepping out of line sometimes is the correct way to go. Because if not, you know, things don't change in your life. You know, you can't change your environment, and you can stay where you're at physically, but changing your environment means so many things, right? Within that are going to help you, you know, live a better life outwards, regardless of where you live at, right? So you're still in Queens, and you're way better than before, right? You feel better. You're doing that work. Another thing that came to mind was how much does that city life influence people and their problems, right? Because I don't know if it's the same thing, you dealing with somebody's issues, right? As a therapist, helping them overcome their issues emotionally, psychologically, that live, let's say, Omaha, Nebraska, right? I was talking to Mitch Strong on my last episode, and he lives in Omaha, right? It's not the same thing living in Omaha than living in Queens, the most diverse place in the world, number one, you know, and one of the boroughs and the biggest, most important city in the world. You know, it's a lot. It's a fast-paced life. I'm pretty sure people go through things that, you know, I've been to New York, and I know how fast-paced it is, and I know I can't live there, right? Because I've already been raised a certain way. I've been raised, you know, in peace when it comes to, you know, the city or the town you live in. New York is a whole another animal, right? And I'm not saying it's bad to live there, but I know for a fact that is a whole type of human being, a whole different type of human being that you have to deal with. So how do you see the difference? What are the differences in a client or a patient that lives in the inner city, that goes through so much during the day, right? That has to hustle extra hard 7 days a week to just pay, you know, a 1-bedroom apartment, compared to somebody else? I don't know how many people you've seen as a therapist outside of New York City, but it's really interesting to me because I'm sure that you know, that weight on their shoulders is really heavy. So talk to me about it.
I've seen, so because of our beautiful licensing board, I mean, I don't really care though. I'm not supposed to see people outside of New York, but I do. I have
Okay.
a very high risk tolerance though. That's why I'm like, whatever, it's fine. So I've had a handful of folks. Granted, they're maybe you would categorize them as still like urban areas, but like you said, there's no energy quite like the hustle and bustle and rat race of this city. And to
Hmm.
me, the thing that stands out the most is folks that have to survive New York. And I'm being very intentional with my language. Like, yes, we live
Yeah.
here, but like we literally have to survive New York. The the state of like nervous system dysregulation, the state
Hmm.
of the ways in which we are constantly inundated with distraction, the level of classism that you have to navigate on a daily basis is just like on a level that I don't think if you live here, maybe LA isn't, because I do have some clients in LA, but it's still different, especially because of the way that we are literally living on top of each other. Like
Yeah.
we're not supposed to be hearing this many artificial sounds every day. We're not supposed to be in such close proximity, like just physical proximity with other bodies every single day. We are literally, our bodies are excreting so much cortisol and adrenaline from the morning you wake up till after you finish work and get home that you're actually never at rest. And when you're never at rest, you cannot access the parts of you that allow you to move out of that tunnel vision and actually look around and consider your environment and your situation in a different way. So, so I think about, my family is from DR, right? And when I've had the chance to go back there, the amount of time time is such a precious resource that
Hmm.
when you are not living in environments like New York, where you don't have time for anything, of course there isn't space for reflection. Of course there isn't place for leisure, for
Yeah.
connection and community. So I think with New York, especially, I mean, now the cost of living here, it's like, I mean, it's intentional, of course, but it's just like insane. You have to have like 4 or 5 jobs. When are
Yeah.
you going to have time to even consider, I think we need a revolution? And it's kind of like,
Yeah.
you,
We need a
let
big
alone your
change.
own well-being. So New York
Yeah.
is an interesting beast. Yeah, I have a lot of opinions about New York, but then it's kind of like, because of my existence and my identity and the way that, you know, I'm I've just been conditioned to navigate the world. I'm also at the place where I'm like, I can't see myself living anywhere else.
Anywhere else.
Like
Yeah, you're conditioned. You're
I'm conditioned. I'm
institutionalized
also
in
a
New York.
victim.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. The
Yeah.
shackles are here. I don't know where to go, but
Yeah.
it that's I think the biggest thing with New York. There's no time. Like I've had so much of my family has moved down to North Carolina, and
Hmm.
we've been able to go down there a lot more.
Hmm.
And time, that's the precious resource. That's really a big reason as to why I wanted to start working for myself too, because I started to realize what good is it making 120K if I literally only have 2 hours to myself a week, and in those 2 hours I'm so fatigued, I'm doom scrolling on my phone, and I'm not actually doing anything to support my physical being, let alone like my spirit and my heart, but they
Sustaining
got us.
yourself is really important to keep going.
Exactly.
So yeah,
They
you have
got
to
us.
sustain that machine. And
Yeah.
it's interesting. How does that manifest in patients? What differences do you see? How do they how does trauma materialize, right? Or manifest in a person from Queens or from Brooklyn or from the Bronx compared to somebody from elsewhere? That's what I was like trying to envision. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that has to affect their psychology as well.
The biggest thing I often see is a challenging relationship with trust, because
Mm,
you're constantly on guard. And because New York, we're most people in New York are working in a very cutthroat industry. It doesn't matter if you're in customer service, sales, tech, there's competition all the time. And something I often see with my clients, when we're talking about the way that their trauma expresses itself, is the way in which they really struggle to trust other people. But really, what that is often is a lack of self-trust within themselves, because they're so disconnected from their intuition and from their physical indicators that allow them to like identify, this is the right way for me to go, this is not the right way for me to go. And that, I think, just speaks to the loneliness that exists in the city, because when we are operating from a perpetual state of mistrust, it impacts the way in which we connect to community. So that's another thing, right? Something that often shows up in my clients is they will have friends that they will go out with to happy hour or whatever, but there is such an epidemic of loneliness in the city because everyone is not actually connecting with one another. My partner he always breaks it down in a way so interesting. I mean, at the time when he first said it, I didn't find it interesting because I was the case study. But he talked about how it's like the New York relationships. Like you know people your whole life, you're around people your whole life, but you don't actually know them. You
That's
don't
right.
actually get
That's
the
right.
opportunity to know them, let alone their family, let alone their story, let alone, you know, what fears they may have, what their values are. But we know each other for 10 plus years, and we chill and we go out, but we don't actually have that soul to soul connection because we're extremely on guard all the time.
That's interesting. Interesting. And how you define your work is intergenerational trauma and liberation centered therapist. You know, you recognize, right, that a lot of this is generational. A lot of this is how past generations, right, didn't have the tools or the knowledge to actually pinpoint what was wrong with their relationships, not only with others, family members, friends, or the society, but also within themselves. And now you take care of therapists as well. I think that's clever, because how many patients can you see really? But if you go ahead and treat other therapists, that multiplies exponentially, right? So I don't know if that was the reason behind it all, but what helped you, what influenced you to see therapists specifically?
So it was a couple different things. The first one was understanding how, our communities need spaces to heal. Like, I really try to not say like everybody needs therapy, because I think therapy can actually, under the wrong circumstance, can be extremely harmful.
That's
But
right.
we need spaces to heal. And under the construct that we exist right now, licensed therapists are the ones that are able to hold and facilitate those spaces. Fine, está bien.
Okay.
But there's a lot of stigma around therapy, right? Therapists don't really care. All they do is like, they're a paid friend. They just repeat back what you said to them, like, and all these things, right? So I think oftentimes when people talk about this negative stigma that folks have around therapeutic support, they always point to like the media, or they point to like horror stories. But the truth is, and I had made a post about this. I was just like, this is an unpopular opinion, but another reason why there's such a negative stigma is because our communities have been interfacing with helping professionals for a really long time, and they have had negative experiences. So they're not just pulling this notion out of their ass. They have
Exactly.
actually been confronted with people that they thought were supposed to support them, and are operating from their own wounds and bleeding all over people who did not cut them. That was always one thing. The second one, to your point, I understand the interconnection of healing. If I'm not well and I'm trying to support someone, there is only but so far that I can take them. I can only meet others as deeply as I have met myself. And I always just thought about, how can I create impact on a community level? So to your point, there's only so many people I can see one-on-one. I can do groups, but there's only so many groups I can run. What
Right.
is a sustainable model to push this work forward and provide therapists a lens and a tool which is not given to us in grad school? And when we talk about modalities that are actually affirming, most of that only exists in post-grad institutions, that if you are a therapist, quote unquote, of color, you cannot access easily, because more money and more loans, right?
Yeah.
So it was just a way to try to basically get therapists to see, but then also allow them to access both micro and meta level skills to then bring forward, right? Like, how can we push these conversations out to the next net, and then the next one, and the next one? And then the other part of it was the way in which I would see how many therapists were, how can I say this? They were just not feeling good about themselves. Oftentimes feeling like they weren't doing enough, struggling with their own complexes, burnout, because they couldn't see that they were still aligning with this like mainstream therapeutic thinking of like, I'm supposed to be a blank slate. I'm supposed to be everything for everyone. I'm supposed
Yeah.
to be a martyr. I only really care if I sacrifice my well-being for the sake of the work. And it's kind of like, that's actually why this stuff is not sustainable. This is why movements
Exactly.
don't move forward, because we are not taking care of the individuals that make up the wider community that is trying to do the work. So how can we also shift your thinking and help you shift the paradigms basically that you work under? So it's been a lot of different reasons, but that was really it. I was just like, I care about the clients, and you guys are getting shit service, and you're just being given referrals to get more evaluations, to get put on meds, to temper you down, and the therapists are also not well. Like, we're all not well, guys. Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah, so many not only therapists, but like so many doctors that are committing suicide because of that pressure, right, of the
Yep.
system and the consequences of our own doings, right? The consequences of us accepting whatever is offered, right? Just because it's, the majority is accepting X or Y, we're supposed to like walk that same route, right? And it doesn't manifest the same way in everybody's lives. So it's good that you are doing the work that you do. And how does that show, right? How does that look like? What things do you offer in these services, right? In these therapies that help them, shake it off and actually step aside as well, or step out of line like you did. How does that look like? What is it that you offer specifically, in that therapy?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting road to create frameworks, because once I started positioning my services towards therapists, I got real hip to the fact that most therapists still just want what they know. So if it isn't a training that will give them their continuing education credits, if it isn't using the language that is familiar to them, like clinical supervision, right? They don't understand, there's pockets, right? And like, so like I'll get affirmed because I'm surrounded by like-minded folks, but when I try to like really expand my reach, they weren't biting. They were like, what? Like, I don't know, that's weird. So I position my services in what's familiar. So I do see therapists for one-on-one therapy. I do individual consultation, which is basically a space for them to talk about their clients, to kind of help them process how to push the client work forward. And I also do that in a group setting. Typically, consultation is just client focused, but the approach I use, it kind of exists at the intersection of the professional and the personal. So typically a conversation will go like, okay, Fulanito has been seeing me for like 6 months and he wanted to talk about his anxiety, and, I give him these tools, but it's like not moving forward, blah, 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 blah. I don't know what to do. So we'll talk about, your client, but also let's tap into how you're feeling when your client is not quote unquote progressing. What is the urgency that you're noticing to help get him to this point? Are you still operating from a space that only values outcomes, and there's an uncomfortability within you of the in-between? Why is this something that at 6 months you feel he should already be here? Are there ways that you're actually indirectly sending him messages that he's not doing well in therapy? Are there ways in which your parts that are frustrated or feeling insecure, how are they showing up in even this session where you're trying to process this client? Because therapists have toolkits, right, with our modalities, but ultimately the main instrument is you. So I always discern between the micro skill is what you use, right? Like I'm using this assessment sheet, or I'm using this worksheet, or I'm using EMDR therapy. The meta skill, which in my opinion is the most important factor, is how you show up in the space. Are you showing up from a space of perfectionism? Are you showing up from a space of control? Are you showing up from a space of avoidance? And maybe there's something your client is saying, but because you have a fear of conflict, you're not naming it for them and robbing them of the chance to actually confront a pattern. So it's not a totally new concept. It's just the approach that I take makes space for the humanity of the therapist, because we are trained to have all the answers. We are trained from a very white savior centered model. And it's kind of like that if we're talking about trauma, and most of the therapists I see serve their own communities. So we're talking about a lot of real shit. Like the therapists I support are not seeing white stockbrokers that live on the Upper West Side that are just stressed because of some bullshit. Like they're supporting real fucking shit, So you have to be continuously suspicious of your attachment to the process and understand why. And you also have to remain present with yourself, because this is relational work that we're doing.
That's right.
So those are the main services. And then now I'm starting to put together just workshops for folks. I've learned therapists love them a good workshop, and I like teaching anyway. So just finding a way to offer the more micro level skills there, because I've wanted to, and I'm glad that people are interested in. When we talk about liberation psychology, something that often stops people from going there is this idea of well, I don't know how to do that. So it's okay, because we're so used to following modalities that offer us instructions. This more abstract concept is something that you may not know how to engage with. Let's talk about what that could look like in practice. So that's the other part of it.
Yeah, the practice is it, right? Because the theory is part of the foundation, but without the practice, you don't know how to question that foundation that you already have, right? Because obviously the foundation doesn't have to be the correct way for this particular community or that particular community, right? So that's something that we have to always challenge to improve. You can't improve without challenging. So I think that's what you're doing, challenging a lot of those foundations that have been provided, right? In school for therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists as well. I like reading in your website, which is Roots and Alchemy, right? That's what it's called. I like the name.
Thank you.
You also have the mental health industrial complex, right? A study in 3 cases, or a study in 3 cases. And then you have the whitewashing of social work history. So these are links that we could actually go to and maybe read, right? All the articles available there. Talk to me about that a little bit, because that's obviously challenging the foundations of this field.
Yeah. So like I said, I always say I'm a social worker by trade, because I think that the definition of a social work under, within this construct is something that I don't necessarily agree with. I think that and there's another social worker, she does such great work. She's on Instagram, Dope Black social worker, where she always says I'm a revolutionary before I'm a social worker. And it's actually all social workers should be revolutionary, that's what I think. So I specifically pinned those articles because, at least in social work, and I do believe that this exists in mental health counseling, that field too. I'm not too sure about clinical psychology. Whatever. I'm not too sure, but I think I know. We're taught that this profession comes from these founders who saw that there were orphans in their communities, and they wanted to create spaces to support children that were experiencing abandonment and all this stuff. And they're really positioned, and I'm not even going to say their name because they get too much fucking credit. They're really positioned as these martyrs and saviors, when the truth is they were aristocrats and they had extra money and extra time. And the reason why they did this was because it was a financial gain and benefit for them. And the way in which we are trained to understand the genesis of our profession perpetuates this savior complex that is part of the reason why we uphold all the isms, if you will. So that article really breaks down the way that social work as a concept really has its roots in activism. And it goes back down the line to really identify individuals before this period that were basically just doing community organizing work. And the whitewashing of our history, I think what it really does is just perpetuate an identity that so many social workers try to embody, and it's a limiting identity. We can only view ourselves as social workers if we position ourselves higher than the communities that we're supporting. When it's like, no, activists are part of the community and we are working with the community and we are supporting each other, and it's not existing from a hierarchy. And the other thing I was going to say was it also, what it does is it keeps so many people of quote unquote color out of the work, because the way that they talk about social work, it's like you're basically a cop. Like you're basically a cop. You're a cop. You're a cop. It's the same system that they're trying to emulate. But it felt important for me for two different reasons to pin that, because I want to make sure that I always leave, as they say, like little Easter eggs about like my values and what I'm about. And sometimes people don't go, and whether it's time or whether they don't know how to, but like you have to dig to find these things, and that's on purpose too. So just like access was another reason why I kind of wanted to make sure like that was like right there too.
It's powerful. That's a lot to unpack. I'm thinking about a lot of things. One of them being the affirmative action issue, how they overturn this, right? Because obviously to get to the level that you're at, you have to go study, right? Where are you going to do that at, right? Because all institutions have questionable practices, right? Especially against our communities. So what do you suggest us to do when it comes to preparing ourselves educationally, right, for this type of work? Number one. And number two, affirmative action. It was overturned by the Supreme Court recently. What is your opinion about that? Honestly, from my perspective, I giggled when I saw the headline. I giggled.
Fair.
A lot of people are protesting, right? A lot of people are distraught because of this issue, and it's going to affect a lot of people, right? Because obviously they're convinced that this is the way. This is the way. This is the beacon of light when it comes to us improving and progressing as a people. I giggled because it's another issue for us to fight against each other. Number one, not only against white supremacy, but also against each other, because the Asian American community is benefiting way more than we are, right? And we actually did the work. We did the groundwork for this to occur, and this is all happening. And I'm like, man, in my opinion, this is another consequence of us not being organized. Okay, because I think if we have the funds, right, we have the financial power to buy a lot or consume a lot, right, especially in Christmas and Mother's Day and St. Valentine's Day and all these holidays, we are able to consume so much. So we have the powers there. Why not invest that money in our own schools, for example? Why not invest that money and that energy in building our own tables and not worrying about being accepted in somebody else's club? You know what I'm saying? Like not everybody has to go to Harvard to make it. Not everybody, there's a lot of groundwork to be done. And I think if we're able to build our own tables, we don't have to ask for access to sit down and actually discuss certain things. And I think that if we're able to organize politically and economically and start building these tables, we'll be able to prevent, that suffering of not being accepted elsewhere. And I think you're doing that in a lot of ways, right? Obviously, you're building your own business and it's community based, but at the same time, it's yours, right? It's not like you needed New York City's permission, right, or all these licenses to actually make it and build your own table. What's your opinion about that affirmative action overturn by the Supreme Court, and how do you see us in the future, dealing with this issue?
I 100% agree with your perspective. My mind, and I guess this is just because of what I do, and I view everything through like a psychological lens. So when that happened and I saw the uproar, the first thing that came up for me was there's a theory in our work called attachment theory. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Yeah. So
I've heard about
attachment
it. I don't
theory.
know it deeply. Yeah.
So attachment theory basically speaks about the way in which, depending on your relationship with your primary caregiver, typically your mom, but then also, just your nuclear family, the level of safety that was there impacts your ability to connect with people. The level of emotional availability, the degree into which your needs were met, really impacts the way that you're able to connect with folks and feel security in that connection. So attachment theory talks about how, if there was a rupture in that attachment for whatever reason, you may fall on a spectrum, right? So secure attachment means, your parents met your needs, there was safety there, you're able to connect in a secure way with people. And then on the other side, we have what people call like anxious attachment, which is like fearful attachment. So like if you think about it in a didactic relationship, most people think about like someone who's clingy and has a fear of letting go. That's because your needs were not met. There was inconsistent like emotional availability, blah, blah, blah. Then avoidant attachment is just the other side of this fearful attachment coin, where again, there was emotional neglect. But if you're thinking about it similar through a person to person relationship, that's the person that is quick to flee and just kind of like avoids anything. So when I saw the way people were reacting to it, what came to my mind was the attachment we have because in psychology, you always think about attachment as person to person, but we build attachments with non-human things all the time. And it just speaks to the attachment we still have with this non-human entity, with this system where instead of pausing, regulating, taking in the full picture, and maybe tapping into that internal wisdom that could actually tell us this may not, the world is not on fire. Maybe this is a redirection. Maybe this is an opportunity. We are clinging on so hard that anxious avoidance is coming through and expressing itself in protesting, expressing itself in these loud, expressions of our rage, when that is like a clue. Like if we bring it down to what people tend to find easier to conceptualize, let's you use that as an example of a person to person. If someone dumps you, are you going to start banging on their door and being like, excuse me, how dare you? We're supposed to be together. Believe me. It's kind of like, no, boo, you got to let it go.
Let it go.
And point yourself somewhere else and see how you can now find whatever security you believe you're going to find from this person. But the person is just this system. I absolutely agree. We need to stop trying to find a seat at the table. And when they do give you a seat at the table, it's intentional. Like they're not just going to give you the opportunity to have power. Like we have to understand every move they play is strategic. So
you're still outnumbered. You're still outnumbered. You asked for a seat at the table. They gave you a seat. Now you're complaining about you're the only one there.
Hello.
Prince used to say, I hope I don't butcher his quote. May he rest in power. Prince. He says, own your masters before your masters own you.
Hello.
But in the end of the day, I think it's time for us to build. We have the resources to. What's stopping us is our own minds, right? That colonized mind, that feeling inferior, right, as well, and that attachment. I'm guessing this is consequences of generational trauma as well.
100%.
We were acting like traumatized people because we are.
Exactly.
So I think that it's really complex because it's not about just American politics. It's not about being liberal or conservative, because when you go to our communities, you find a lot of complexities, a lot of diversity when it comes to ideals and perspectives, right? And there's a lot of conservative people in our community, and there's a few liberal, right? And there's a lot of clashes within our own selves too. So I think we have to stick to our guns in investing more time in ourselves, learning what works, what doesn't work. You know, if I tried for over 150 years to be part of the table and I'm not being accepted, God damn it, you know, like I have to look elsewhere, right? That means that the grass is greener on the other side, because this one I've been complaining about for the past, you know, how many years, how many centuries, right?
Exactly.
So, and rightfully so. The thing is that I'm not going to keep pointing fingers when I already know who put me in the pit, right? Now I have to invest some time on how to organize and what methods I'm going to use to get out of the pit. And I think you're doing a great job from my psychological and community-based point of view. I really like what you're doing, especially from where you're doing it from, right? Like Queens. I was going to ask you, like, Queens is the most diverse place in the world when it comes to ethnicities and cultures, right? Does that show in your patients as well? A lot of them are from Queens.
A lot of them, I would say maybe like a third that actually ended up being from Queens, just because when they found me, they probably put like closest to me. So yeah, 100%. And I have clients that are first gen from the Philippines. I have from India. I have Colombian. I have Dominican. It 100% shows up. And to your point, right? This is actually why I go so hard for like healing spaces and psychology, because to me, that's like the missing piece in the way we've been moving. And I say that because it's kind of like, and obviously I'm biased, right? But like, so much of this is psychology. Like, what is white supremacy but the manifestation of the psyche of white bodied people? What is capitalism but the manifestation of the psyche of these small group of people that hoard resources and power? Like, we have tried the route of just using political education. We have tried the route of just using community organizing, of mobilization tactics. We have tried the route of religion. We have tried the route of education, but we are not really digging our heels in the reality of the mindsets of the people we are trying to organize, and what about that, and what about their traumatized bodies and psyches are creating barriers within our own communities to push us forward. I think that there is not enough dialogue around ways that we can begin to integrate that in any liberation work that we do. We can't get people who are wounded to get up and do things that need to happen, you know. And it's I always move between, because, you know, I have parts of me that get frustrated and try not to get jaded around like, we've been doing the same thing for how long, the same conversations, like what is going on? Do we not care enough? Then I fluctuate to the part of me that is like empathetic to a fault, right? Like I totally understand why, but it doesn't have to be binary thinking. It's neither is the way to go about it, but what is that sweet spot in the middle where we have to understand, and only empathy is the vehicle to that there are things that are missing on an individual level that can support this communal work that we're trying to do. And also, but we got to get shit done. Like,
that's right.
You know, but
So I thank you. I'm really grateful for your time. I'm grateful for your work. My flowers to you.
Thank you. I appreciate
you are always welcome in the Crossroads to talk more about anything else that you are working on. I heard that you're doing workshops. You mentioned it earlier. When is your next workshop? You know, how does what do you offer in those workshops, and how does that work? How can someone benefit from that?
Yeah, so the next workshop, I'm literally in the process of just like outlining that. So my goal is to have it launch come September for the fall. And then I want to be able to give folks like monthly access and do, you know, having it be on like an equitable pay scale. So like, I don't want cost to be an issue as to why you can't participate. And I think that's also like just going back to like having a business and like understanding ways where you don't have to adhere to these like restrictive and oppressive, like, you know, capitalist standards. But the way folks can find them, if you go to my website, rootsanalchemypllc.com, and you just go to the side for therapist providers, you can sign up for my newsletter and you'll get updates right in your email. If you don't want to go on my website and you want to go on Instagram, in my bio. If you click on that link, you can also sign up for my newsletter as well. Or I post all my stuff on Instagram. That seems to be the best way to kind of like organize and get people together, because everybody's on social media all the time. And my Instagram is Roots and Alchemy.
Roots and Alchemy. She's also a social chemist, right? Not only a therapist, not only a social worker by trade, but yeah, there's social chemistry as well that has to be built, right? And there's 100%. Certain ingredients that we need to know how to mix. It doesn't come to, you have to dig for jewels. You know, it's not going to just drop on your lap out of nowhere.
Did you see that on my Instagram when I broke down why I picked my name?
Nah.
Because that's pretty spot on.
Yeah?
Yeah.
No, I haven't seen it. It just came up to me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on. And let's go ahead and say goodbye with the shook ones.
There you go.
Yes. Take care.
Take care.
They never come close to. I can see it.